We continue our sessions today. Our last talk is what do we need to know about human nature. Professor Louise Antony from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst will be giving the talk. Her work is exceptionally wide-ranging, and it has been incredibly influential in a number of fields: philosophy of mind, epistemology, feminist theory, and philosophy of language. One of the volumes she's edited is one of my favorite books, and one of the few on my shelf that I've actually read and enjoyed reading. Philosophers Without Gods, a collection of essays by leading philosophers reflecting on their life without religious faith. She's also edited Chomsky and His Critics. That's the title of a book. She didn't actually edit Chomsky. With Norbert Hornstein, and a Mind of One's Own, Feminist Essays on Reason and Objectivity with Charlotte Witt. Her essays include Natures and Norms, Multiple Realization, Keeping It Real, Atheism as Perfect Piety for the Love of Reason, Everybody Has Got It, A Defense of Non-Reductive Materialism in the Philosophy of Mind, and Because I Said So, Toward a Feminist Theory of Authority with Rebecca Hanrahan. We are absolutely thrilled to have Louise Antony with us today. Please help us welcome.
So thanks very much to Yuval and for inviting me, and Amy for handling all the arrangements, which was not easy. I'll just say that because of me. This presentation is going to be based on my paper Natures and Norms, and I don't know if anybody else is interested in the topic. I hope so. It's something that I began thinking about when I came to the conclusion that a view that I had defended earlier in my career was wrong. So this is why that was wrong. But there are other people than me who defended it. So I will be talking about one person who defended it in a very important way, and that's Martha Nussbaum. Okay, so it's something of a commonplace that if you want to do political or normative theory, you need to know about human nature. Why? Why? What's supposed to be the significance of human nature for normative projects? Well, there are basically two views. There's a view that I call the Constraint Conception that says that human nature tells us what we can and cannot do. And then there's something that I call the Mandate Conception that says that human nature tells us what we ought to do. Now, both of these views enjoy a great deal of popular appeal. Let me start with the Constraint Conception. The Constraint Conception has been very popular with conservatives. They tend to make appeals to human nature in defense of the status quo. The Mandate Conception has been popular with progressive thinkers. They tend to appeal to human nature to press in some way for social reform. The main thesis that I'm going to defend in this presentation is this. It's a conjunctive thesis. There are many plausible senses of human nature in which it's true to say that human nature exists, that there is such a thing as human nature, but there's no one sense of human nature that can do all of the work it's supposed to do. And this is true whether you are trying to defend a constraint conception or if you're trying to defend a mandate conception. So the good news is going to be that progressives who are rankled by the conservative appeal to the constraint conception do not have to deny the existence of human nature in order to oppose the conservative agenda. But they cannot at the same time appeal to human nature in order to support their own progressive agenda. All right, so let me start talking about the constraint conception and a little bit of history about it. I'm going to move through these slides somewhat quickly because I think probably the things that I'm going to say are the things I'm going to cite are familiar to a lot of you, and also the quotations are long. But I want to explain a little bit about why the constraint conception has given human nature a bad name. So a little more detail, the constraint conception says that human nature places limits on the kinds of social arrangements that we can achieve and on the kinds of behavior we can expect human beings to display. And the background principle that's being invoked here is the ought implies can principle, which not everyone accepts, but it seems to be pretty intuitive to a lot of people. That is, it's unreasonable to expect people to do things that they are incapable of doing. Now, the constraint conception works by assuming that whatever this is that's true by nature cannot be changed. So that's going to be the constraint. That's the source of constraint. Nature, then, to function in the constraint conception, has to have modal force. It's going to have implications for what's possible and what's not possible. The constraint conception has been popular with philosophers. So we have Immanuel Kant, from the crooked timber of humanity, no truly straight thing can be made. It's popular with pundits. John Stossel of ABC News, in a presentation in a special called Boys and Girls Are Different, said, "Isn't it better to act on the basis of what is true rather than saying it has no right to be true?" It's popular with scientists. E.O. Wilson, the Harvard entomologist, says, "The genes hold culture on a leash. The leash is very long, but inevitably values will be constrained in accordance with their effects on the human gene pool." Now I'm going to comment on that, the leash can be very long part. It's also very popular with economic conservatives, and it's urged against a variety of programs of social reform, particularly those that involve some kind of social investment or socially governed redistribution. It's also urged against various kinds of pacifist movements, whether they're focused on a particular war or war in general. And the claim here is that acquisitiveness and aggression are natural. So if you don't have human institutions that allow some outlet for those things or channel those things in fruitful, in constructive ways, it's going to be terrible, unlike the way the world is now. That was a joke, and you should just feel free to laugh. Okay, so relatively recent example of this, a paper by someone named Will Wilkinson from the Cato Institute. He says, "The key political lesson of evolutionary psychology is simply that there is a universal human nature. The human mind comprises many distinct specialized functions and is not an all-purpose learning machine that can be reformatted at will to realize political dreams. The shape of society is constrained by our evolved nature. Remaking humanity through politics is a biological impossibility on the order of curing cancer with pine needle tea." I guess he knows more about cancer than I do. I don't know. Maybe you can cure cancer with pine needle tea. I also just want to highlight something here that I'm going to resist the temptation to spending a lot of time talking about, and that is the identification of what's known in philosophy of mind as the massive modularity thesis of cognitive architecture, with the view, the supposition that the only way of opposing a radical empiricist, non-structured cognitive architecture is the massive modularity thesis. There are other alternatives. Okay. Now here are some of the findings of evolutionary psychology according to Wilkinson. We are coalitional, we are hierarchical, we are envious, zero-sum thinkers. Property rights are natural. Mutually beneficial exchange is natural. Now, interestingly, what this means is that capitalism is the natural form of human economic organization, which it's taken us most of our 120,000 years on the planet to actually construct. But this is what's natural. All right. There's going to be a lot of that. The constraint conception has also been very popular with social conservatives who want to oppose various kinds of demands for egalitarian reform, as, for example, feminism. The constraint conception here says that not only do we have a human nature, but there are different group natures, and the differences between people are natural and therefore unchangeable. Now this I'm going to just go through at a romp. Philosophers, famous philosophers have led the way in promoting this idea that human differences reflect different natures, and that those different natures justify inegalitarian social organizations. I'll go back and read the quotes at some point if you like, but Aristotle's on board, Rousseau's on board, Kant's on board. I have to read this quote: "The fair sex is fairly incapable of principle. Men's faculty of understanding is sublime, women's is merely beautiful." And I see my Kant teacher in the audience, so I'm cringing because I know that Ed's thinking that I'm slandering the man. But okay. Now there's an interesting progression, and this has to do with this long leash business that I was talking about earlier. The beginning of the constraint conception argument usually is something about explanation. I'm just going to tell you why these things are the way they are, right? I'm going to tell you why in every human society women take care of children and men do other things, and why it is that men generally are in charge of making decisions and women are not. So it's just an explanation. And the point of this first explanatory step is to say that it's not human choice or human conventions that is responsible for the inegalitarian arrangements that we see. It's nature that causes social inequality. So you saw this with Herrnstein and Murray in their book, The Bell Curve, claimed that that prejudice was not responsible for the low SES of African Americans compared with European Americans. It's that the African Americans had low IQ. You can also see it in Lawrence Summers's notorious talk at Harvard at a conference investigating the poor demographics for STEM subjects at Harvard and other elite institutions with respect to women. Summers says it's not discrimination that explains the paucity of women in elite science. It's actually a lack of mathematical genius. He's been a bit misunderstood. He didn't say that women were on average less good at math than men. In fact, he insisted that they were. He said that men are overrepresented at the tails, meaning there are many more male geniuses, but there are also many more male idiots. So you're not supposed to feel bad, women, about not being geniuses because you're not idiots, so, or something like that. Okay, but we quickly move from explanation, which is simply a non-normative, I mean, not that explanation has no normative component, but there's not a normative agenda if you're just trying to find out why things are the way they are. But we move quickly to something normative, which is rationalization. So there's a quick move from saying this is the cause of the inequalities that we see to the conclusion that attempts to socially engineer around those inequalities in nature are going to be pointless. We'll encounter one of two problems. Either they'll backfire, so the thing you'll get, so see what happened to the Soviet Union? You want that to happen? Okay, so stop asking for single-payer health care, because that's what's going to happen. Or they're going to make us miserable. And I want to linger on this option, because this is going to be the thing that comes back to bite advocates of the mandate conception. So what we get is, we get this notion of a kinder, gentler constraint, the long leash. So here's Wilson again. He says, one way or another, intuitively or with the aid of science, evolutionary history will be entered in the calculations, because human nature is stubborn and cannot be forced without a cost. Another writer, a popular author named Daniel Crittenden, excuse me just a second. Wrote a book back in what I fear is the 90s called What Our Mothers Didn't Tell Us, complaining that feminism had really, really let women down. Feminism, for all its efforts, hasn't been able to banish fundamental female desires from us. and we simply cannot be happy if we ignore them. So it's told women, you can have it all, you can have your careers, you can have your children, or you can just have your careers and not have your children. And they were lying because we all really want to have our children. And if we don't get to have our children, or we have to have our children while we're trying to get tenure at the same time, we're going to be miserable, which is true, but it follows from the trying to get tenure part, not from the having it all part. All right, so what response do these appeals to the constraint conception evoke? Well, one response is what I'm going to call somewhat tendentiously radical social constructivism. So this is the view that says there's no such thing as human nature. That's an illusion. Maybe it's a piece of ideology, but what it is not true. There are no pre-social givens that structure human possibilities. Now, this is a bit of a caricature. I don't think anybody quite believes this, but there are a lot of people that say things that sound a lot like this. For example, Monique Fatigue, Judith Butler, who says that sex, as well as gender, that is the social significance assigned to sex, is socially constructed. I think that these views are more subtle than that, but this is certainly a defensible surface reading of these writers. There's also a tendency to deny the existence of innate individual differences. We're really all the same. Take anybody, give them the same advantages and they'll come out just as well. Now, I think there are a bunch of problems with this view. The first one is rhetorical. It's a PR disaster. It makes progressives look like lunatics. Okay, so here's George Will writing a column about Daniel Crittenden's book. He says, "This indicates just how out of touch, how out of joint the times are. Human nature is startling news. Asserting that there is a human nature has become a radical political act which today's feminists stigmatize as reactionary." Okay, which is sort of funny because it's like, have you read anything in the last 4 centuries? The position to beat has always been that there is a human nature. Okay, but there are other problems. A set of problems that I'm very concerned about is empirical problems. So I think there's enormous evidence that there are robust physical and psychological commonalities among human beings. What I mean by that is that if you look at variation within species with respect to various kinds of properties, like, for example, language use, the variance is going to be explained by differences in the genome. I do not want to commit myself to saying that there is such a thing as a biologically well-defined notion of the human genome. I think that's a mistake. But I do think that it's extremely significant that the variance is largely explained between us and non-human animals in terms of genetic differences. I also think that there are extremely strong poverty of the stimulus arguments coming from cognitive psychologists, developmental psychologists, and also ethologists studying animals that support the view that of cognitive nativism, that say that human brains are ceteris paribus structured in such a way as to facilitate various cognitive functions. Just as spiders have little spider brains that enable them to spin their webs without explicit instruction, our little human minds are structured in a way that allows us to acquire language under conditions of casual exposure, which no other animal can do. I'm not saying it's a good thing or bad thing, it's just the way it is. So I think that the radical social constructionist line, to take that line, fosters this idea that anybody that defends any kind of nativism must have this kind of constraint conception agenda. Furthermore, I think there are individual differences. Most of us are genetically singular, and our genotypes do structure our possibilities. I'm not going to go into a great deal of detail about this, but they structure our possibilities in a way that does not give any aid or comfort to the applications of the constraint conception that I was talking about. The genotypes structure at most a norm of reaction, which is an unbelievably complex function that carries genotype to phenotype under a variety of circumstances. And this has been further complicated, this realization has been further complicated by work in development that emphasizes the importance of timing of certain environmental variables. So it's hugely complicated. There's not going to be any easy conclusion to draw, even if you knew what even if you know your genotype, about what is going to happen in any given environment. But it's wrong to think that there aren't differences between us with the consequence that different kinds of environments might affect different individuals very differently. Okay, but the problem that I want to focus on is one that many progressives have, and that is a normative problem. Many progressives argue that social constructivism undermines the possibility of progressive appeals to human nature. So, in particular, I have in mind Martha Nussbaum, who writes this: "We urgently need a version of essentialism in public life. If we reject it, we reject guidance that is crucial if we are to construct an adequate account of distributive justice to guide public policy in many areas." And this is from a paper of hers called Human Functioning and Social Justice in Defense of Aristotelian Essentialism. But this material and this argument she's developed in a number of different works and papers, all directed, by the way, at the very important practical project of trying to come up with measures of degrees of justice in various societies, a project that she was involved with Amartya Sen. Okay, so the problem, as Nussbaum sees it, and I agree with this, is that social constructionism of this radical sort gives rise to a kind of relativism, which Nussbaum calls anti-essentialism. So here are the elements that Nussbaum finds problematic. First of all, it suggests that the notion of harm is itself a socially constructed notion, or at least a socially dependent notion, and that harm is going to be relative to whatever desires one happens to possess. None are any better than any other. So if you have just a straight utility maximizing model of whether things are going well, you just ask people what they want, you see if they've gotten it or not. If they haven't, they've been harmed. If they do, then they're fine. Nussbaum also thinks that it's problematic that the radical social constructionism leads to a kind of relativism that has there be no fact of the matter about what kinds of lives are better or worse for human beings. Now, I partly agree with this, I partly don't agree with this, and we'll get to that. But what she has in mind is that social constructionism does not give you a basis on which to say if people are not getting enough to sustain bodily functions, like if young girls are not getting enough fat in their diet for them to have menstrual cycles, that's objectively a problem. And Nussbaum also feels that this social constructionism is going to leave us without any objective facts about who or what beings have rights, that it will just be up to some kind of social consensus or consensus among the powerful who counts as a member of the moral community and who does not. And I should mention here that someone who agrees with Nussbaum, I think in probably at least the first and the third of these, is Noam Chomsky, a philosopher named Harry Bracken, talking about Locke's view of kinds and persons and animals, said that the Lockean, the empiricist conception of mind, which has kinds simply correspond to regularities in sensory experience, doesn't give you any basis for thinking that it's right or it's wrong to call somebody a human being. If your experience is that all human beings are white, then that's what's going to construct your concept of human beings, and to say that black people are not human beings is just true. Bracken said, on the other hand, if you're a rationalist and you think that some kind of cognitive or emotional or psychological competence is the basis of personhood, then you have an objective basis for saying, for criticizing these more superficial views about who belongs in the moral community. He summed that up by saying that rationalism raises a mild conceptual barrier to racism. And Chomsky has quoted that remark approvingly. Okay, so what's the mandate conception going to do for us? Well, Nussbaum advertises it this way. She says it's going to provide a basis for a uniform account of how human beings ought to be treated and of the kinds of activities and situations that enable them to flourish. Now, this conception is going to make another assumption about what nature entails, and that is that what's natural is good for us. So for this to work, nature has to have normative force. This is a view that's also been promoted by Susan Oken in response to a very serious problem, I think. She points out that in a very controversial article of hers called "Is Multiculturalism Bad for Women?" that was the subject of a Boston Review publication with critics. Oken says that talk of use of terms like toleration, multiculturalism, and respect for difference can actually be cover for the neglect or the perpetuation of grave substantive harms done to women. And I think she's right about that. Nussbaum cites an example of a case discussed by a French anthropologist where I don't know the facts about the actual practices in India. I'm just taking this from Nussbaum's account of what the anthropologist said, that there was a particular goddess who was worshipped. Her cult had to do with protection from the smallpox disease, and that when the British program of pan-vaccination wiped out smallpox in India, the cult of this goddess fell off, and the French anthropologist was bemoaning this fact. And someone in the audience said, I can't believe you're saying this. I mean, surely it's better to be healthy than to be ill, to live rather than to die. And the French anthropologist apparently says, well, no, it sort of depends, which Nussbaum found outrageous and dishonest, as I do too. Okay, but there are objections to the mandate conception. And these are the explicit objectives that Nussbaum offers. First, we're after a conception of human nature that's going to provide a substantive and objective account of harm and benefit. So it's not just up to what individuals contingently want, it's a fact about them as human beings. And it's going to determine objectively the extent of the moral community. It's going to articulate these, what are going to turn out to be the capabilities, such that anything that has the capabilities is objectively a member of the moral community, whether you like it or not. And finally, it's going to support normative distinctions among stated desires. And I think this is a very, very important objective. It's long been known by economists, and you can find recognition of this problem in John Stuart Mill and The Subjection of Women, that people have a tendency to change their preferences, either consciously or unconsciously, in response to what they perceive as their menu of options. And that the process can be such that someone may state that they don't want any more food, when in fact there's no possibility of their getting more food. And this can be true whether they're just in a very poor society or whether they're in an oppressive condition where they don't have control of the amount of food that they consume from the family's allotment. Now, associated with each of these objectives, however, Nussbaum realizes that there are a variety of risks. So when you're searching for a substantive theory of harm, there's a risk that you will neglect autonomy. It may be that people autonomously want to do things that your theory of harm says is harmful. And an example that I have in mind is very young children who decide they want to be athletes or musicians and devote enormous time and energy to developing these skills, possibly to the detriment of more general skills like reading and socializing and so forth. And I think there can be a real question about whether it's the right thing for a parent to do to allow the child to do this. But I think it's I think it could be a defensible answer that no, the child has autonomously decided to do this. Then there's, when we're looking at how to determine the extent of the moral community, there is a risk of prejudicial application, right? We have to be very careful that we choose capabilities that aren't just going to have the consequences for moral community that we anticipated or that we wanted in the start. And finally, the normative distinction among desires risks paternalism. It risks that we will go around telling people what's good for them. Okay. Now, I think that's maybe the place to focus to see what I take to be the fundamental problem with this strategy. if one's nature determines what is good for one, what is wrong with the following? What is wrong with Danielle Crittenden saying, feminism for all its efforts hasn't been able to banish fundamental female desires from us, and we simply cannot be happy if we ignore them? Where did she go wrong? Now, what Nussbaum is going to want to say is she must have gotten this premise about what fundamental female desires are from the wrong methodology. So let's see. I have a diagnosis of what's gone wrong. And I'm going to begin my diagnosis with a bold conjecture, and that is that all arguments from nature are unsound, that they all make a mistake of one sort or another. Either they equivocate on nature, that is, they use one sense of nature in one part of the argument and a different sense of nature in another part, or they contain a false premise. If their understanding of nature is univocal, one of the premises is going to be false, or both. So here is, I'm sorry, I have not been pointing, I had these notes about where you were in your handout to point them out, and I haven't been doing that. This is 6 on your handout. This is the normal form of an argument from nature. I'm so sorry.
We don't have the handouts anyway.
Oh, I think they were on the chairs.
We're under the chairs.
I'm sorry. So if there was something I said you're pretty sure was wrong, you might be able to find it on the handout. I'm very sorry. Okay, so this is 6 on your handout, Roman numeral 6. This is what I'm calling the normal form of an argument from nature. When somebody makes an appeal to nature, I contend that you can force it into this form. So it will contain at least one premise saying that something is true by nature. I call that the N, or the nature premise. Then it will contain a premise that says something about what follows from something's being true by nature. So in the 2 cases that are going to concern us the most, the premise is going to say either what's true by nature is unchangeable, and that's what would be characteristic of a deterministic argument from nature, or it's going to say what's true by nature is good for us, and that's going to be what's determinative of something's being a paternalistic argument from nature. And then the conclusion will be, therefore, X, the thing that's true by nature, is unchangeable in one form, or good for us in another form. So the common premise is always going to be the claim that X possesses some property P by nature. A deterministic premise says that what's true by nature cannot be changed, and a paternalistic premise says what's true by nature is good for you. Now, I'm just going to say briefly what equivocation is in case there's anyone who doesn't understand, who hasn't heard that term or hasn't encountered it in this particular context. So I apologize. I hope that I'm not patronizing all of you, wasting your time. Okay, so equivocation is using an ambiguous term in 2 different ways in the context of a single argument. So, for example, I keep my money in a bank. Banks are damp places. I keep my money in a damp place. Obviously, the sense of bank that makes the first premise true means financial institution. The sense that makes the second premise true is riverbanks. And it doesn't follow, if I make those replacements, that I keep my money in a damp place. I keep my money in a financial institution, riverbanks are damp places. The conclusion is just a non sequitur. So that's what I claim is going on fundamentally with arguments from nature. So the first thing I have to do to persuade you of this is to tell you what different senses of nature are. And these are easy to recognize. So one sense is what I'm calling typicality / universality. So here you're picking out the typical properties of a kind X. These will tend to be properties of things of kind X that they have in common with other things of kind X. Another sense is what I'm going to call definition. In this sense, the nature of something is what a thing must have in order to be properly called an X. So just what the definition tells you. There's another sense, normality, what's statistically normal or usual for X's. I'm not going to make much out of that. sense in this talk. And then there's something that I call centrality. Here the idea is that nature is something centrally important about being an X. And there are different kinds of centrality. There might be explanatory centrality. And this is what I think is in play when we talk about Lockean real essences, or at least as contemporary philosophers like Putnam have understood that appeal to real essence. It's a deep property, possibly a hidden property, that explains a great deal of the thing's other more superficial or observable properties. There's also, I think, something that I'm calling prudential centrality. And here the idea is that we're focusing on what is valuable to or for X's. So love is part of human nature. That might be a claim that having affectional connections to people is prudentially very important for us. And then there's normative centrality, what's morally important for X's. Okay, so let me give you an example of an equivocal argument from nature, a really obviously bad one. So the end premise says human beings are by nature prone to heart disease. In this case, paternalistic premise says what's true by nature is good for human beings. The conclusion is, therefore, we ought to promote heart disease. Obviously, something's gone wrong. Now, I think that the first premise, N, can be true in the universality or typicality sense of nature, and it might also be true in the explanatorily central sense of nature. That is, it might be something about our fundamental constitution that gives us these vulnerabilities in our vital organs. P, however, is obviously false. Right? In that sense of nature, P is obviously false. Okay, so now what I want to show you is that both constraint conception arguments and mandate conception arguments end up making the same mistake. So let's look at the constraint conception arguments. What the constraint conception needs is a premise, a deterministic premise that says if X is natural, then X is inevitable. So it needs a notion of nature which is going to make necessary the relationship between the properties said to be natural and the other properties that are said to follow from the nature. In the case of mandate conception arguments, we need something different. The mandate conception arguments are going to use a paternalistic premise P, if X is natural, then X is good or good for you. And so now what we're going to need are non-normative facts about natures that entail normative conclusions. The mandate conception is also going to need natures to be essential to individuals. If it's not part of your individual nature, then nothing's going to follow about what's good for you. And it needs natures to be sought at the right level. And I'll explain why I say that. Okay, now just some general observations on different senses of nature. First of all, to say that something is natural or part of nature or true by nature in the sense of universality doesn't tell us anything about, first of all, why all X's have these properties in common. The explanation might refer to biology, but it also might refer to environment. So, for example, it seems to be universally true of human societies that we wear some kind of clothing. Is that because we have, it's part of our genome that we want to wear clothing, or is it part of a sort of evocation from the environment of a response that makes a lot of sense and that we've all hit on independently in lots of different places and times? It also, this sense of nature, calling a property natural in this sense, is consistent with any level of contingency whatsoever. And that's not going to be of any use to the constraint conception. Another thing it's not going to tell us about is why it's X's rather than Y's that we're interested in. So, and you'll see the application to Crittenden's argument. Why are we interested in human beings rather than women, or women rather than human beings, or human beings rather than animals? Nature can be asked about in the universality sense at any of these levels. What privileges the level at which we are going to be drawing these normative conclusions? Okay. So that's going to be a problem for the mandate conception. There's no objective determination of where we should be, what level of generality we should be focusing on. Okay, definition. Now, definition is a matter of a relationship between satisfying one set of conditions and satisfying another set of conditions. So in the definitional sense, we're saying that to be a member of the kind P, one must be Q. That doesn't say anything about any individuals having to be P or not being able to be Q. It says only this conditional claim that one cannot be a P without also being a Q. Definitional natures, therefore, need not be essential, and that makes them unuseful for the mandate conception. So, it's definitionally true that in order to be a voter in the US, I must be a citizen. But it doesn't mean that I have to be a voter, that it's part of my essence, or that there's any necessity about my being a voter. I may not be a citizen, but I could become one. So definitional notions are not going to be much help, certainly not to advocates of the mandate conception. Okay, explanatorily central natures, for example, genotypes, may partly explain universality, language among human beings. Right? So I want to allow that, yes, genomic similarities among human beings may explain, as I said, the variance between us and other species. But the explanation is always going to be indirect when we're trying to explain a phenotypic property in terms of a genetic property. The phenotype, as I said earlier, is always going to be a function of genotype and environment and random factors. So, and this is a point that Richard Lewontin has emphasized in a beautiful argument called the analysis of variance, the analysis of cause, that you must not confuse the explanatory project of seeing, with respect to a set of populations in a given environment, what explains the variance between them. Don't confuse that project with getting an analysis of the causal force, relatively speaking, of the genes in the environment. The latter project makes no sense. Genes and environment are always equally causally potent. Okay, finally, maybe this is finally, even if universals can be explained genetically, it doesn't follow from that that group differences within the population are explained genetically. And this is something that many people criticized Herrnstein and Murray for not realizing with the bell curve. So it may be that the difference between human beings and bonobos, or human beings and chimps or apes, with respect to the conditions under which we acquire language, that's to be explained by genetic variation. It doesn't follow from that if you have groups of human beings who don't have language for some reason, that it's because they're genetically various from the individuals that do. Or, to take a more loaded example, the higher IQs of human beings, relatively speaking, relative to other animals, is probably, the variance is probably going to be, almost certainly going to be explained genetically. That doesn't mean that differences in tested levels of intelligence, whatever that might be, but those differences on scores, that doesn't have to be explained genetically. That variance doesn't even have to be explained genetically. So, individual genotypic differences do not entail that phenotypic differences are inevitable. In terms of the norm of reaction, this complex function that takes genotype and environment to phenotype, you can have crossing norms of reaction. It could be that one strain of plant does best at high elevations and worst at medium elevations, and another instance of that same species of plant is just the reverse. It does, I forgot what I said, does better at the other elevation, and you get the picture. I got a picture later on if you want to actually understand that, what I said. Okay, so I conclude, and there's a lot more to be said about this, but I hope that you will at least think that it's plausible that these explanatorily central natures are not going to be of any use to the constraint conception. However, explanatorily central natures may tell us something about prudential interest, but only to the extent that they explain the interests that we actually have. They cannot show any particular interest to be necessary, though they can give us some explanation for why some of the interests that human beings have seem to be very broadly shared. In particular, explanatorily central natures cannot give us the notion of Aristotelian flourishing that Nussbaum wants. Okay, let me see. I think I'm going to skip that. I'm going to skip the equivocation and constraint conception argument because I'm a little bit behind time, and I think it's probably pretty clear how that works out. So let me skip to Nussbaum's mandate conception. She calls her position Aristotelian essentialism for a reason, and now here, since I've embarrassed myself in front of my Kant teacher, Martha isn't here, but she would be horrified by what I'm about to say about Aristotle. All right, so at least a received view, this is Nussbaum. So this is how Nussbaum is going to deploy Aristotelian essentialism. It's going to give us the nature premise. Human beings are rational agents by nature. We'll get the paternalistic premise. What's true by nature is good for us rational agents. Therefore, it's good for us to preserve and foster our rational agency. Here's the equivocation. I guess I'm going to slaughter Aristotle in another couple of slides from here. Okay, so here's the equivocation. When we say that human beings are rational agents by nature, and that it's true by nature, what's true by nature is good for us as rational agents, what's the notion of nature involved? Well, let's suppose that the notion of nature is definitional. Okay, so for it to be the case that you are a human being, it is also the case that you are a rational agent. There are ways of defining human being in such a way that rationality is essential to being a human being. That would make the end premise true, but it's going to leave P false or unjustified, probably unjustified. It's just a non sequitur to say that it's a good thing. Moreover, saying that we are by nature rational agents doesn't determine the level of abstraction at which we're looking at human life. So it raises the question why my human nature, rather than my, say, female nature, or why my individual nature as an individual being, why any of those things should be determinative. Now let's suppose that we use the universal sense of nature. Now the problem is that that's not going to carry any moral or prudential significance. Why should my values or preferences or goals be in any way constrained by what's true about people in general? So Nussbaum wants the notion of nature to provide objective determination, remember, of what counts as harm, of the distinction between autonomous and merely adaptive preferences, the extent of the moral community, and for that she needs a value-neutral conception of nature, because values are going to bring in subjective values. That was the whole problem with relativism and the anti-essentialism that she's opposing. But she also needs the conception of nature that's going to entail value. And here is where we get what I call the Aristotelian star theory of function. So this is the Classics Illustrated Comics version of Aristotle's Ethics. We have, first of all, the claim that the function of human beings is that which is distinctive of human beings. And that follows a general formula that Aristotle articulates for finding the function of anything, that which it does uniquely well or better than anything else. Okay, so we look and see what is that for human beings, and we decide it's rationality. Now, Aristotle also thinks that when you know the function of something, you know what's good for that thing. So what's good for human beings is the development of their rational capacities. So a good human being is a human being who exercises rational capacities. There are problems with this argument. One thing is that it equivocates on good. Right? In the same way you would equivocate if you say a good bomb is a bomb that explodes, this bomb exploded, therefore this bomb is good. And furthermore, just as a matter of polemics and rhetoric and pragmatics, if this strategy worked, it would validate the moves of social conservatives like Wilkinson and Crittenden. And it would threaten autonomy. Okay, so here are my conclusions overall. Progressive reformers have nothing to fear from the constraint conception, but they cannot invoke the mandate conception to ground their own reformist programs. But that raises the question, what are we supposed to do about the very important problems, theoretical and practical and political problems that Nussbaum and Oken have articulated. Where can justification for programs that are critical of things that are harmful to people, where can that justification be found? Well, what I want to say is that we have to ground those programs in an appeal to actual but contingent human properties, preferences, and values. Now, there's a sense in which I think it's a very good thing for this project that there is a human nature, particularly in the universality sense. I think it really would be very difficult to imagine how we could have moral community with each other if we did not have powerful resemblances among ourselves, and resemblances that enabled us to understand and sympathize with each other in a fairly unreflective and spontaneous way. If we really had to figure out from scratch what people valued, what hurt them, what kinds of things helped them function well, I think it would probably be very difficult to have a normal functioning social community. Our commonalities as human beings makes it well within our powers, however, to figure out how we ought to behave toward each other. So here's where explanatory human natures, I think, can help. The existence of explanatory natures, which I'm assuming are going to lie at the genomic level, give us reason to believe that there are some universals of preferences and that these preferences are robust. Things like aversion to pain, susceptibility to injury, and physical capacities. On the psychological, cognitive side, basic rationality, language, sociability, and social understanding and curiosity. But what's important about these properties is that they are themselves morally significant. If a being has the capacity to feel pain, then prima facie, morally, you have a duty not to cause that being pain. That just seems to make sense. If creatures are language users, then prima facie, it's a harm to them to prevent them from communicating with other beings. So what's important is the possession of these morally relevant properties. It doesn't matter how the properties got there. It doesn't matter whether the properties were the result of natural selection over eons and are in the genome in some to be defined sense. It doesn't matter if aliens came and zapped them, like in 2001. It doesn't matter if God, as in Peter Van Inwagen's story, miraculously raised a small breeding group of hominids to rationality. It doesn't matter if they materialized in a swamp. None of these things matters. What matters is they have the properties in question. Moral community should extend to any being that possesses these properties, regardless of what kind they're a member of. That's all you need, the morally relevant properties. So, in conclusion, the uselessness of natures. The fact of commonality in preferences and values, I've argued, is enough to permit moral community, and it's also enough to give us grounds for skepticism about the autonomy of certain stated desires, desires that seem aberrant. But what are we supposed to do when someone who's manifestly not getting enough to eat says, I don't feel hungry? Or someone who is being abused in a relationship says, but I know he loves me, or I know she loves me. What are we supposed to do? Well, I think that what we need to do is investigate further. The fact that it's an aberrant desire can certainly be a rational cue to find out more what's going on. And one thing to look at is the menu of options available to this person. If a person who said they weren't hungry, if the social circumstances could be changed so that without great social cost, they could get enough to eat, would they then choose enough to eat? And I think that the attitude that this requires is one that recommends itself anyway. It requires humble and respectful engagement with the individuals that we seek to understand. So that's the attitude we ought to take anyway. So I don't think we've lost anything. So thank you very much.